The radio crackled with static and panic. Forward operating base Vanguard was burning. Black smoke twisted into the Afghan sky like the fingers of something dying, clawing upward as if searching for mercy that wouldn't come. Colonel Marcus Hendricks stood in the Tactical Operations Center, his jaw tight enough to crack molars, watching the drone feed flicker across 3 monitors. His men were pinned. 2 platoons, 47 souls, trapped in a valley that had become a coffin with mountain walls. The Taliban had come from everywhere at once, North Ridge, East Canyon, even from tunnels they didn't know existed. Air support was 18 minutes out. His boys didn't have 18 minutes. They had maybe 5. Vanguard Actual, this is Dealer 2-1. We are Winchester on 40 Mike, small arms only, taking fire from all sides. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Davies, 24 years old, married 3 months before deployment. Hendricks could hear the suppressed terror beneath the professional calm. Every squad leader learned to sound composed even when staring at their own death. It was part of the training. It didn't make it easier to hear. Hendricks glanced at Major Petrov, his operations officer. Petrov's face was granite. "Sir, Falcon package is still 16 minutes. Apache are rearming at Bagram. We've got nothing close." "What about the Warthog?" Sir, Petrov blinked. "The A-10, the one that's been circling for the last 20 minutes. I saw it on the tracker." Petrov pulled up the air asset display. A single blip labeled HAWG-17 moved in lazy circles 40 miles southwest. That's Sergeant Cale Renner, sir. She's on a ferry flight back to Kandahar. No ordnance, no mission tasking. She's basically flying an empty truck home." Hendricks stared at the blip, then at the drone feed showing his men dragging wounded behind a collapsed mud wall while muzzle flashes sparked from a dozen positions around them. The math was simple and horrible. Get her on the line. "Sir, she's not even loaded. What's she going to?" "Get her on the goddamn line, Major." Petrov worked the radio. 30 seconds of static. Then a voice came through, calm as Sunday morning with the faintest trace of a West Virginia drawl. "Vanguard TOC, this is Hog 17, go ahead." "Hog 17, what's your payload status?" A pause, then almost apologetic. "TOC, I'm slick. No ordnance, no gun rounds, just fuel and a prayer. Was inbound for scheduled maintenance when you reached out." Hendricks closed his eyes. Of course she was empty, because this day couldn't cut them a single break. He was about to call the retreat order when Sergeant Cale Renner spoke again. "But I'm 15 minutes closer than anyone else you've got, and I can be real persuasive when I need to be." Something in her voice made Hendricks hesitate. It wasn't bravado. It was something else. Something that sounded like a promise carved from experience and loss. Cale Renner had been flying the A-10 Thunderbolt II for 7 years, and people still introduced her as the girl Warthog driver like it was a novelty act. She'd stopped correcting them around year 3. Let them underestimate. Let them smile their patronizing smiles and make their jokes about parking and asking for directions. She'd learned early that competence was its own revenge. The Hog loved her back, and that was all that mattered. The aircraft was ungainly, ugly, built around a gun that could shred tanks and a titanium bathtub that kept pilots alive through hell itself. It was slow. It was loud. It was perfect. Today's flight was supposed to be simple. Ferry the bird back to Kandahar, sign off on the maintenance sheet, grab a shower and 6 hours of rack time. She'd been up since 0:30 running actual combat sorties farther north. Expendable ordnance long since scattered across grid coordinates she'd already half forgotten. Her flight suit smelled like sweat and JP-8 fuel. Her lower back ached from the ejection seat. She was ready for something boring. Then Vanguard TOC called. She listened to Colonel Hendricks explain the situation in clipped, desperate sentences. 2 platoons encircled. No air support close. She was the only asset within range. But she had no weapons, no 30mm hate, no Mavericks, no bombs, just an airframe and 11,000 pounds of thrust. Hog 1-7, if you can't engage, we're calling full retreat, Hendricks said, and Cale heard what he wasn't saying. Full retreat meant leaving wounded, meant men would die on that valley floor because there weren't enough hands to carry them and shoot at the same time. She checked her fuel. She checked her position. She did the math in 3 seconds and made a choice that would define everything that came after. Negative Vanguard, hold your retreat, I'm inbound. Sergeant, you're unarmed. Respectfully, sir, I'm flying a 10-ton titanium statement of intent with a pair of turbofans that make God himself pay attention. Sometimes just showing up is enough. She banked hard southwest, pushing the throttles forward, feeling the Hog's reassuring rumble through her boots. The mountains rose ahead, jagged and unforgiving under the afternoon sun. Somewhere in those shadows, American soldiers were counting their last magazines. Cale Renner intended to buy them enough time to count a few more. The radio chatter from Dealer 2-1 was getting worse. She could hear the gunfire now behind Lieutenant Davies' transmissions. We've got technical with a DSHK on the North Ridge, Jesus, RPG. RPG right side. Cale's jaw tightened. Vanguard, Hog 1-7 is 5 minutes out. Request coordinates and current disposition. Major Petrov rattled off the grid reference and the tactical picture. Cale visualized it instantly, her men in the center, enemy in elevated positions on 3 sides. A kill box, textbook perfect. Without ordnance, she couldn't eliminate the threat, but she could complicate their day considerably. Dealer 2-1, Hog 1-7 on your frequency. I'm unarmed, but I'm pissed off. Where do you need me? Davies' response came back stunned. You're dry. Bone dry, but I can make noise and I can fly low. Pick me a target. They called her Clover because of a mission 2 years ago that nobody was supposed to talk about, but everybody knew. The story went like this. She'd been tasked with close air support for a special forces team that walked into an ambush outside Mazar-i-Sharif. By the time she arrived overhead, the team was down to 4 effectives, surrounded, running out of ammunition, making their peace. She'd expended her entire gun load, 1,200 rounds of 30mm death, and all 6 rockets. The enemy kept coming, so she did something no one recommended and everyone remembered. She descended to 200 feet and made gun runs without ammunition, using the sound of the GAU-8 Avenger's barrel rotation and the scream of her engines to simulate attack runs. The enemy, hearing that warthog roar and unable to see her ordnance situation, scattered for cover. She bought 90 seconds. The QRF helicopters arrived in 80. All 4 Green Berets went home. They started calling her Clover because she made her own luck, because she refused to accept the limitations other people assumed, because when the book said you were done, she wrote new pages. Now she was doing it again. Cale came in low over the valley, so low that her shadow raced across the rocks like a ghost just ahead of her. She spotted the grid coordinates, saw the smoke, saw the muzzle flashes sparking from a dozen positions. Her threat warning system stayed silent. No radar locks, just small arms and RPGs. Old-fashioned murder in an ancient place. Dealer 2-1, I've got visual, I see you. And she did. The Americans were pressed behind a collapsed compound wall, barely holding. The Taliban fighters were maneuvering, moving closer, sensing victory. On my mark, I need every man who can shoot to light up the North Ridge. Make them think you're about to assault. What we can't. Trust me, on my mark. She pulled the Hog into a hard climb, gaining altitude, positioning. Mark. Below, the Americans did as ordered. A sudden eruption of rifle fire toward the North Ridge. The Taliban fighters there ducked, confused, and Cale rolled in. She came down screaming. The A-10's dive angle was steep, aggressive, her altitude dropping like a stone thrown at the earth. She toggled the gun trigger not to fire but to spin the barrels, producing that distinctive metallic snarl, BRRRRRRRT, that every insurgent in Afghanistan had learned to fear. No rounds came out, just noise, just fury, just the promise of annihilation. She pulled up at 400 feet barely, the hog groaning, her own vision tunneling from the G-forces. The Taliban fighters on the North Ridge heard the sound and did what humans do when their hindbrain screams danger. They scattered, dove for cover, abandoned firing positions. For 15 seconds, the volume of incoming fire on Dealer 2-1 dropped by half. 15 seconds was enough to pull 2 wounded men farther back behind cover, enough to redistribute ammunition, enough to breathe. Colonel Hendricks watched on the drone feed, his mouth open. Did she just? She's making dry gun runs, Major Petrov said, his voice somewhere between awe and disbelief. She's bluffing them. Cale climbed, circled, lined up again. Dealer, I'm coming back around. East Canyon this time. When they hear me, shift your fire there, keep them guessing. Hog, you're going to get shot down doing this, Davies said. But there was hope in his voice now, threading through the fear. Then they better not miss. She rolled in again. This time her angle was shallower, her speed higher. She roared across the valley at 300 feet, turbofan screaming, and toggled the gun again. BRRRRRRT. The sound bounced off the canyon walls, multiplied, became something monstrous and everywhere. The Taliban fighters in the east positions flinched, sought cover, stopped shooting for precious seconds. Again, Dealer 2-1's squad seized the moment, reloaded, repositioned, dragged more wounded to better cover. Cale pulled up and her threat warning chirped. Someone down there had an SA-7, a shoulder-fired surface-to-air missile. Old Soviet hardware, barely functional but functional enough. She popped flares, bright magnesium flowers blooming behind her. The missile, if it even launched, didn't find her. She climbed, breathing hard, sweat stinging her eyes. Her fuel was dropping fast. These low-altitude runs burned gas like a bonfire. She had maybe 3 more passes before she'd have to turn for Kandahar or risk flaming out over hostile territory. 3 more chances to make a difference. Vanguard Hog 17, what's the ETA on actual air support? Falcon package is 8 minutes out, Hendricks said. Can you hold that long? Cale checked her fuel, did the math. It was going to be close, frighteningly close. I can hold as long as they need me to, sir. It wasn't bravado. It was a simple statement of fact. She would stay because her brothers on the ground needed her to stay. Anything else was unthinkable. She lined up for another run. Lieutenant Derek Davies crouched behind the wall, his rifle hot in his hands, and watched the sky. He'd never seen an A-10 fly like this, aggressive, reckless, personal. Every pass she made drew fire away from his position, gave his men seconds to work with. Seconds were currency in a firefight. Seconds bought lives. His radio operator, Corporal Lima, looked up at him with wide eyes. LT, that pilot's insane. That pilot's keeping us alive, Davies snapped. He keyed his radio. Hog 17, we've got technical trucks moving in from west approach, probably reinforcements. Can you discourage them? On it. Cale adjusted her orbit, spotted the 2 pickup trucks racing toward the fight, machine guns mounted in the beds. She checked her fuel again. This was going to hurt, but she'd made a promise, and Clover didn't break promises. She came in from their 6 o'clock, low and fast. The lead truck driver saw her shadow, panicked, swerved. The truck behind him couldn't react in time. They collided in a cloud of dust and shrieking metal. Cale roared overhead, her engines howling, close enough to see the fighters scrambling out of the wreckage. She didn't fire. Didn't need to. The crash did her work for her. Vanguard, 2 technicals neutralized via aggressive flying and poor enemy driving skills. Hendricks laughed despite himself. It was a ragged, desperate sound. Hog, you are certifiable. I prefer committed, sir. She climbed again, searching for threats, her fuel gauge mocking her. 5 more minutes. The Falcons would arrive in 5 minutes. She just had to hold 5 more minutes. She could do 5 minutes. She'd done harder. Then she saw the man with the RPG on the south ridge. He was positioning, aiming not at her but at Dealer 2-1's position. A direct shot. The wall they were using for cover wouldn't stop a rocket-propelled grenade. She didn't think, didn't hesitate. Kale rolled indirectly at him. The warthog screamed down, her airspeed climbing, her angle aggressive beyond sanity. The man saw her coming, swung the RPG tube toward her instead. She held the dive, held it, every instinct screaming to pull up. At 300 feet she saw his face, saw his finger tighten. She popped flares and pulled hard, physics crushing her into the seat, the world graying at the edges. The RPG passed beneath her left wing. So close, too close. The hog shuddered but held together, turbofans roaring defiance, and Kale leveled out at 200 feet with her heart trying to jackhammer through her ribs. Behind her, the RPG struck a rock face and detonated harmlessly. The shooter stood frozen, staring at the sky where she'd been, probably reassessing his life choices. "Dealer, South Ridge threat neutralized," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline screaming through her veins. "How's your situation?" "Manageable now," Davies replied. "Thanks to you. We've consolidated wounded, set a perimeter, can hold until fast movers arrive." "Good, because I'm about to be a glider." Her fuel warning light glowed amber. 3 minutes of flight time remaining. Maybe. The Falcons were 2 minutes out. She'd done it. She'd actually done it. Then she heard the sound. It was wrong. A vibration through the airframe, subtle but growing, something loose or damaged or failing. She scanned her instruments. Oil pressure fluctuating on the right engine. Temperature climbing. The RPG hadn't hit her, but something had. She ran through the possibilities, small arms fire, a lucky round finding something vital, battle damage she hadn't noticed in the chaos. Vanguard Hog 17. I'm showing anomalies on my right turbofan. Might have taken damage. Can you make it back? Kale did the math again. Kandahar was 90 miles east. She had fuel for maybe 40. Negative. I'll need to find somewhere closer to put down. There is nowhere closer, Sergeant. It's all hostile. She knew, she'd known from the moment she'd committed to this insanity. But she also knew that 47 men were still breathing because she'd made that choice. Sometimes the math worked out. Sometimes it didn't. Then I guess I'm taking the scenic route home, sir. The right engine temperature spiked into the red. She shut it down, running single engine, her airspeed dropping. The Hog could fly on one turbofan, but not well, not far. She turned east anyway because what else was there to do? Below her, Dealer 2-1 held their perimeter. Above her, 2 F-16 Falcons streaked into the valley with full weapon loads and righteous anger. The cavalry had arrived. Her job was done. Now she just had to survive it. Major Petrov watched the data link, his face pale. She's losing altitude. Single engine, fuel critical. She's not going to make Kandahar. Colonel Hendricks felt something cold settle in his chest. Where's the nearest landing zone? Highway 1 may be 20 miles northeast, but it's unsecured, could be crawling with Taliban. What are her odds if she tries to dead stick in the mountains? Petrov didn't answer. He didn't have to. Hendricks keyed the radio. Hog 17, Vanguard actual. We're vectoring QRF to Highway 1. Can you make that? Kale checked her remaining fuel, her altitude, her single wheezing engine. I can make it, or I can make a very expensive crater. Let's find out. She nursed the Hog eastward, coaxing every ounce of performance from the dying airframe. The aircraft shuddered, protested, kept flying anyway because warthogs were built by people who understood that sometimes you needed to bring the pilot home more than you needed elegance. The titanium bathtub around her seat was designed to take hits from anti-aircraft fire. It would probably survive the crash. Probably. Her altitude was 2,000 feet and dropping. The mountains slid past below, utterly indifferent to her struggle. She thought about her family back in Charleston. Her brother, her mother, the dog she'd had as a kid named Ranger. She thought about Davies and his men, safe now, heading home eventually to tell stories about the crazy warthog driver who saved them with nothing but noise and audacity. That was enough. If this was how it ended, at least it meant something. Highway 1 appeared through the haze. a thin ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through the desert. She saw no vehicles, no signs of the QRF. Just empty road and the Hindu Kush staring down at her like judges. Vanguard, I've got visual on Highway 1, commencing emergency landing. QRF is 4 minutes out, Hog. Can you wait? Her fuel gauge hit 0. The remaining engine coughed. Negative, I'm out of time. She lined up, dropped her landing gear, hoped it locked properly because she had no hydraulics left to check. The Hog descended, sluggish, heavy, a 23,000-pound brick with delusions of flight. The highway rushed up. Too fast. She was coming in too fast. Cale Renner touched down hard enough to crack teeth. The landing gear shrieked, the airframe bounced, slammed down again. She stood on the brakes, felt them bite, felt the Hog slewing sideways. The highway was narrow. Too narrow. Her right wing clipped an abandoned truck hulk on the shoulder and the world spun into chaos. Metal screamed. The wing tore away, the airframe pivoted, and Cale was thrown against her harness hard enough to see stars. The Hog slid 300 feet on its belly, grinding metal and sparks and apocalyptic noise, before finally, mercifully, stopping. Silence. Absolute silence except for the tick of cooling metal and her own ragged breathing. Cale's hands shook as she unbuckled, checked herself for injuries. Bruised, battered, but whole. The canopy was intact. She could see sky. She popped it manually, heard the hiss, felt fresh air that smelled like dust and survival. She climbed out onto the wing, or what remained of it, and jumped down to the highway. The Hog lay behind her like a fallen angel, right wing gone, belly scraped raw, engine nacelles smoking, but she'd landed it. She'd brought it home, broken as it was. The QRF Humvees arrived 2 minutes later, soldiers spilling out with rifles raised, scanning for threats. A staff sergeant approached, staring at the wreckage, at Cale standing there in her flight suit covered in sweat and determination. "Ma'am, are you injured?" "I'm fine, the plane not so much." He looked at the Hog, at the missing wing, at the furrow it had carved into the asphalt. "You flew that here missing half a wing." "Wasn't missing when I started," Cale said. She allowed herself a small, exhausted smile. "Lost it on the landing, but the guys at Vanguard are safe. That's what matters." The staff sergeant just shook his head, something like awe flickering across his face. They loaded her into a Humvee and drove her back to Kandahar. She spent the entire ride staring out the window, watching the Afghan landscape scroll past, thinking about choices and consequences and the thin line between heroism and stupidity. Thinking about Davies and his men, about the faces she'd never seen but saved anyway. When they arrived at base, Colonel Hendricks was waiting. Colonel Marcus Hendricks had commanded men in 3 wars and seen courage in forms both loud and quiet. But what Sergeant Cale Renner had done orbited something beyond courage, something that lived in the territory where competence met audacity and refused to blink. He waited as she climbed out of the Humvee, disheveled and exhausted, her flight suit torn at the shoulder, a bruise darkening her cheekbone. She saluted. He returned it, then extended his hand. "Sergeant Renner, that was the damnedest thing I've ever witnessed." "Sir, I was just doing my job." "Your job was to ferry an aircraft to maintenance. You did considerably more than that." Cale met his eyes, didn't flinch. 47 men, sir, the math was easy." Hendricks studied her. She was young, maybe 28, with dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun and eyes that had seen things that aged you faster than years. There was no arrogance in her expression, no hunger for recognition, just the quiet certainty of someone who knew their worth and didn't need external validation. "I'm putting you in for a medal," he said. "Sir, I'd rather you didn't." "Why?" "Because I didn't do it for a medal. I did it because it needed doing, and because every pilot I know would have done the same thing." Hendricks doubted that. Most pilots would have followed protocol, stayed out of an engagement without ordnance, reported back that the asset was unavailable. Following the rules would have been defensible, logical. It also would have killed Dealer 2-1. The medal stands, Sergeant, dismissed. She saluted again and walked toward the barracks. Hendricks watched her go, then turned to Major Petrov, who'd been standing nearby, silent. "Find out everything about Sergeant Renner's service record," Hendricks said. "I want to know who trained her and why she's still an NCO instead of wearing officer's wings." "Sorry." "Because pilots like that are rare, and the Air Force should be doing everything possible to keep them flying." Petrov nodded and left. Hendricks remained, staring at the mountains, thinking about the radio transmissions he'd heard, the impossible thing he'd witnessed, thinking about luck and skill and the indefinable quality that separated the competent from the extraordinary. Cale Renner didn't go to the barracks. She went to the flight line, to where they'd towed what remained of her aircraft. Hog 17 sat under floodlights, surrounded by maintenance crews who circled it like surgeons examining a patient that survived against all odds. The right wing was gone, torn away at the root. The left wing bore scorch marks and small arms impacts, at least a dozen rounds that had punched through aluminum but missed anything critical. The belly was scraped raw, titanium scored and dented but intact. Her crew chief, Technical Sergeant Marcus Acaffer, spotted her and jogged over. He was a stocky man from Detroit with hands that could tear down an engine blindfolded, and opinions about airframe maintenance that bordered on religious conviction. "Sergeant Renner," he said, his voice tight, "you trying to give me a heart attack?" "Didn't plan it that way, Chief." He gestured at the Hog. "Do you have any idea how many regulations you violated? Flying combat maneuvers without ordnance, single engine over hostile territory, belly landing on unsecured highway." He trailed off, then shook his head. 47 men, I heard. That true?" "2 platoons, yeah." Acaffer studied her, then looked at the aircraft. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted, the anger drained out, replaced by something quieter. "She held together, took everything they threw at her and brought you home anyway. The Hog's a good bird. The Hog's a miracle wrapped in titanium, and you flew it like you meant it." He paused. "I'll have her flight ready again in 2 weeks. Might take me 3 to source a new wing, but I'll make it happen." Cale shook her head. "Chief, that airframe's done. Look at her." "I've seen worse, trust me." He patted the scarred fuselage like it was a favored dog. "This bird's got more flights in her. You just gotta give her the chance." Cale didn't argue. She knew that tone. Crew chiefs developed relationships with their aircraft that defied logic. Acaffer would rebuild Hog 17 even if it took every off-duty hour he had, because that's what crew chiefs did. They kept their birds flying and their pilots alive, and they took both responsibilities with equal seriousness. The story spread. That's what stories do in war. They spread like fire, jumping from person to person, mutating slightly with each telling but retaining the essential truth at their core. By morning, every airman at Kandahar knew about the Warthog driver who saved 2 platoons with nothing but engine noise and reckless determination. By afternoon, the story had reached Bagram. By evening, it was circulating through forward operating bases across the entire theater. Details shifted. Some versions had her shooting down a helicopter with harsh language. Others claimed she'd landed the Hog on one wheel while reciting the Gettysburg Address. But the core remained constant. Clover had done the impossible. Again. Lieutenant Davies and his men returned to Kandahar 3 days later, dirty and grateful and alive. They asked to meet her. Cale tried to decline, uncomfortable with the attention, but Colonel Hendricks made it an order. So she found herself in a briefing room facing 47 soldiers who stood when she entered and whose eyes held something that made her throat tight. Davies stepped forward. "Sergeant Renner, my men wanted to thank you personally." "You don't need to thank me, Lieutenant. You did the hard part. You held." "We held because you gave us the chance to." He held out his hand. When Cale shook it, she felt something pressed into her palm. She looked down. A small patch, unit insignia for Dealer 2-1, signed on the back by every man in both platoons. "We'd be honored if you'd wear it," Davies said quietly. Cale looked at the patch, at the signatures, at the faces of men who'd stared at death and been given a reprieve. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Later, alone in her quarters, she sewed the patch onto her flight suit, just below her call sign. Clover. She traced the embroidery with one finger, thinking about luck and choices and the strange calculus that let some people go home while others didn't. Thinking about the weight of other people's lives and how it never really left your shoulders once you'd carried it. She slept deeply that night, dreamless, the sleep of the profoundly exhausted and the quietly content. The Distinguished Flying Cross arrived 2 months later, presented in a ceremony that Cale endured with minimal grace. She stood at attention while Colonel Hendricks read the citation, while a two-star general she'd never met pinned the medal to her uniform, while cameras flashed and people applauded. She said the required thank yous, shook the required hands, smiled the required smile. Then she escaped to the flight line as quickly as military courtesy allowed. Hog 17 was waiting. True to his word, Chief Akaffer had rebuilt her. New wing, new engine, fresh paint covering the scars. The aircraft looked almost factory new except for one detail. Along the fuselage, just below the canopy, someone had stenciled a small 4-leaf clover. Beneath it, in careful lettering, 47. Cale touched the clover, the number. Akaffer appeared beside her, wiping his hands on a rag. "Couldn't resist," he said, not apologizing. "Seemed appropriate." "Chief, you're a sentimental fool." "Guilty, you taking her up." "Should I?" "She's ready, passed every inspection, flew like a dream on the test flight." He paused. "She missed you." Cale laughed despite herself. "Aircraft don't miss people, Chief." "This one does." He handed her the maintenance logbook already signed off. "Go on. You've got 3 hours before sunset. Perfect flying weather." She took the logbook, ran her pre-flight check, strapped into the cockpit that felt like coming home. The Hog started on the first try, engine spooling up with that familiar roar. She taxied to the runway, received clearance, advanced the throttles. The acceleration pressed her into the seat, the rumble vibrating through her bones, and then she was airborne, climbing into the Afghan sky with the Hindu Kush sprawling below like ancient gods watching mortals play at flight. She flew for 2 hours, running through maneuvers, testing the Hog's responses, relearning the partnership between pilot and machine. Everything worked flawlessly. Akaffer had done his job with the precision of someone who understood that perfection wasn't optional. When she finally returned, landing smooth and easy, she shut down the engines and sat in the cockpit for a long moment, listening to the silence, feeling the weight of everything that had happened settle into memory. 3 weeks later, Cale's deployment ended. She packed her gear, said her goodbyes, walked across the tarmac one last time with her duffel over her shoulder. Chief Akaffer shook her hand at the transport plane, his grip firm, his eyes suspiciously bright. "You take care of yourself, Sergeant." "You too, Chief, and take care of 17. "Always," he hesitated. "For what it's worth, you're the best pilot I've ever crewed for, and I've been doing this for 22 years. Cale didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded and climbed aboard. The C-130 lifted off, carrying her away from Afghanistan, away from the mountains and the dust and the war. She looked out the window as the landscape shrank below, thinking about the strange trajectories that bring people together and then split them apart. Thinking about Dealer 2-1, about Davies and his men, about the seconds and choices that echo forward through time. She returned to Charleston. The Air Force, in its infinite wisdom, assigned her to a training unit where she spent the next year teaching young pilots the intricacies of close air support and low-altitude tactics. She was good at it, patient, clear, willing to share the hard lessons she'd learned. Her students respected her, then revered her when they learned her story. Clover became something of a legend in the warthog community, a name spoken with the kind of hushed reverence usually reserved for aces and Medal of Honor recipients. But Cale Renner never sought that recognition. She showed up, did her job, went home to her small apartment and her books and her quiet life. On weekends, she visited her mother, helped her brother with his landscaping business, took her nephew to baseball games. Normal things, human things. The world turned. The war continued without her. She was okay with that. Then, 18 months after Afghanistan, she received a letter. It was from Lieutenant Davies, promoted now to captain, returned to Fort Campbell and readjusting to garrison life. The letter was 3 pages long, handwritten, describing his life and his gratitude and his struggle to make sense of having survived when probability suggested otherwise. The last paragraph made her eyes sting. "I think about that day constantly," he wrote. "About the sound of your aircraft and the impossible thing you did and the fact that I'm alive to write this letter. I don't know if there's a purpose to any of it, if surviving means I'm supposed to do something extraordinary with the life you helped save. But I'm trying. I'm trying to be worth the chance you gave me. I hope that's enough." Cale kept the letter. She kept all the letters that followed because Davies wasn't the only one who wrote. Over the following months, others from Dealer 2-1 reached out. Corporal Lima sent pictures of his wedding. Sergeant Holloway sent a birth announcement for his daughter. Private First Class Trent sent a graduation invitation. He was finishing college on the GI Bill, first person in his family to get a degree. Each letter, each message, was a small testament to continuity, to futures that almost weren't. She answered everyone, not with false modesty or deflection, but with genuine interest in their lives, their struggles, their small victories. She attended Lima's wedding, traveled to Kentucky for it, stood in the back of the church and watched him marry a woman who cried through the entire ceremony. At the reception, Lima introduced her to his bride. "This is Sergeant Renner," he said. "She's the reason I'm standing here today." The bride hugged her, fierce and wordless, and Cale held her and thought about the invisible threads that connect people across distance and circumstance. Thought about how one choice, one moment of refusal to accept the limitations others assumed, could ripple outward through time in ways impossible to predict or measure. The Air Force promoted her to staff sergeant, then technical sergeant. Her superiors wrote evaluations that used words like exceptional and irreplaceable. They offered her a commission, a path to becoming an officer. She declined. She preferred flying to administrating, preferred the direct simplicity of being responsible for an aircraft and a mission rather than navigating the politics and paperwork of command. They respected her choice, because by this point her reputation preceded her, and nobody wanted to be the officer who forced Clover into a role she didn't want. She deployed twice more, once to Syria, once to Iraq. Both tours were quieter, routine close air support missions without dramatic last-second rescues or missing wings. She was grateful for the boring competence of it, for the opportunity to do her job well without making headlines. Not every mission needed to be legendary. Most were just work, skilled and necessary and unglamorous. That was fine. That was enough. Between deployments, she continued training new pilots, continued writing letters to the men of Dealer 2-1, continued her quiet life in Charleston. She adopted a dog, a retired military working dog named Kevlar who'd lost part of his hearing to an IED blast. They were well matched, both veterans, both carrying invisible scars, both content with silence and companionship. She ran with Kevlar in the mornings, watched sunrises over the harbor, counted her blessings. Colonel Marcus Hendricks retired from the Air Force 3 years after that day at Vanguard. He moved to Colorado, bought a cabin in the mountains, tried to forget the weight of command and the faces of men who died under his orders. But some memories don't fade. Some memories insist on being remembered. On quiet nights, he thought about Sergeant Cale Renner and the impossible things she'd done, and the fact that 47 families still had their sons and fathers and husbands, because one person refused to accept that the situation was impossible. He wrote a book about leadership and decision-making in combat. An entire chapter was dedicated to that day, to the call he'd made, to the sergeant who'd responded. He changed the names, followed security protocols, but anyone who'd been there knew the story. The book did well, was adopted by military academies, sparked discussions about the difference between following rules and accomplishing missions. Hendricks received a call one evening from an unknown number. He answered. The voice was familiar, careful, touched with that West Virginia drawl. Colonel Hendricks, this is Cale Renner. I read your book. Sergeant Renner, I hoped you would. You made me sound braver than I was. I wrote it accurately. You made the rest look brave by showing up. A pause, then quieter. Thank you, sir, for trusting me that day, for giving me the chance. Thank you for proving I was right to trust you. They talked for an hour, comparing memories, filling gaps in each other's narratives. Hendricks learned about her life post-deployment, her students, her dog. Cale learned about his struggles with PTSD, his therapy, his slow journey toward something resembling peace. Before they hung up, Hendricks said something he'd been carrying for years. You know the real reason I ordered you in that day? It wasn't tactical genius. It was desperation. I was out of options and out of time, but you took that desperation and turned it into something else. Into hope. That's not a skill they teach. That's character. Remember that. Cale sat in her apartment after the call, Kevlar's head in her lap, staring at nothing. Character. She'd never thought about it in those terms. She'd just done what needed doing, made the choice that seemed obvious. But maybe that was the point. Maybe character was just the accumulated weight of choices made when nobody was watching, when the rule book said quit but your conscience said try. Master Sergeant Cale Renner, promoted again, much to her quiet embarrassment, received orders for one final deployment before her 20-year retirement. Afghanistan again. Kandahar again. The war was winding down, drawdown in progress, but the Air Force still needed experienced pilots to manage the transition. She packed her gear, kissed Kevlar goodbye, flew across the world one more time. Kandahar had changed. Fewer aircraft, fewer people, the whole base taking on the half-abandoned quality of something being systematically dismantled. But the flight line remained, and the warthogs remained, and the mission remained. She checked in, received her briefings, was assigned an aircraft. Hog 17 was still there. She found Chief Akafer, impossibly still assigned to the same aircraft, looking older and grayer but smiling when he saw her. Figured you'd be back eventually, he said. I kept her ready. You're still here. Where else would I be? This old bird needs me. He patted the fuselage. And apparently so do you. Cale walked around the hog, running her hands over familiar panels. The small clover was still there, faded now but visible. The number 47. Fresh paint covered newer scars. This aircraft had flown hundreds of missions since their last flight together, supported countless soldiers, earned its place in the history of this war. She's still flying? Cale asked. Like a dream. Some of these newer pilots, they don't respect the old girl, but she's got more time left in her than most of them. Akafer handed her the logbook. Pre-flight's done. She's all yours, Sergeant. Cale strapped in, started the engines, felt the old familiar rumble. Nothing had changed and everything had changed. She taxied to the runway, received clearance, took off into an Afghan sky that looked the same as it had 7 years ago. Time was strange here, circular. Men came and went, but the war remained, constant and patient and indifferent to individual stories. She flew patrol routes that felt like muscle memory, checked in with ground units whose call signs changed but whose needs didn't, returned to base as the sun set, painting the Hindu Kush in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if they didn't represent a place that had consumed so much blood and hope. Over the following weeks, she settled into routine. Missions, maintenance, meals, sleep, the rhythm of deployment. But something felt different this time. Final, like a story reaching its conclusion. 2 months into her deployment, Cale received a message through official channels. Captain Derek Davies, now stationed at the Pentagon, had put in a request to visit Kandahar on official business. The timing aligned with her deployment. Could they arrange to meet? She said yes. Davies arrived on a gray morning, stepping off a C-17 in dress uniform rather than combat fatigues. He'd aged well, still lean, a few silver threads in his hair now, eyes that carried weight but not brokenness. When he saw her on the flight line, he grinned. "Clover, Captain Davies, you're looking official. Pentagon will do that to you, sucks out your soul but makes you look professional." He shook her hand, then surprised her by pulling her into a brief hug. "It's good to see you." "You too. What brings you to scenic Kandahar?" "Officially, drawdown logistics briefings. Unofficially," he glanced at Hog 17. "I wanted to see you and the bird that saved my life before this whole thing ends." They walked the flight line together, talking about the intervening years, about the men of Dealer 2-1 and where they'd ended up, about the strange process of transitioning from war back to something resembling normal life. Davies told her about his work at the Pentagon, about policy decisions and budget meetings, and the surreal disconnection of managing a war from air-conditioned offices. "I think about that day constantly," he said eventually. "The sound of your engines, the way you dove at that RPG guy like you were personally offended by his existence, the fact that you did all of it without a single weapon." He stopped, looked at her directly. "Why'd you do it, really?" Cale considered the question. It was one she'd been asked dozens of times by reporters and commanders and students. She'd given different answers depending on the audience, duty, training, refusal to abandon fellow soldiers. All true, none complete. "I did it because I couldn't live with not doing it," she said finally. "Does that make sense?" Davies nodded slowly. "Yeah, it does." They stood in silence for a moment, watching maintenance crews work on other aircraft, listening to the sound of turbofans spinning up on the far side of the field. "You know how many kids I've got now?" Davies asked. "No idea." "Three, 2 boys and a girl. The youngest, Emma, she's 4, obsessed with airplanes." He smiled. "I'm teaching her about the A-10, about the pilot who saved her dad's life before she existed. She draws pictures of warthogs in crayon. They're terrible, but she's very proud." Cale felt something crack open in her chest, something warm and vast. "You didn't have to tell me that. I wanted you to know, wanted you to understand the scope of what you did. It wasn't just 47 lives. It was all the lives that came after. My kids, Lima's wife, Holloway's daughter. All of it exists because you refused to fly away." She didn't trust herself to speak, so she just nodded. Davies stayed for 3 days. They had dinner with other pilots, swapped stories, laughed at military absurdities. On his last evening, he asked if she'd take him up in the Hog. Regulations technically prohibited it, but Cale called in a favor with the operations officer, pulled some strings, made it happen. Davies strapped into the back seat, technically a maintenance position, barely room for a human, and Cale flew them over the valley where it had happened. "Right there," Davies said over the intercom, pointing at a grid coordinate. "That's where we were pinned." Cale banked the Hog circling the valley. It looked peaceful now, just rocks and dust and empty space. No smoke, no gunfire, no dying, just geography, indifferent to the human dramas that had unfolded across it. "You see it differently from up here," Davies said quietly. "Everything looks different from altitude, cleaner, simpler." "Is that why you fly?" Cale thought about it. "No, I fly because I'm good at it, because the aircraft makes sense when nothing else does, because up here the rules are simple: physics, procedure, skill. You do your job right, you go home. You take care of your bird, it takes care of you. And when your bird is out of bullets, and the people below need help anyway, then you improvise," she smiled, "and hope physics is in a generous mood." She brought them back, landed smooth, taxied to parking. Davies climbed out slowly, his legs cramped from the tiny space. He stood looking at the Hog for a long moment. "Thank you," he said, "for this, for all of it. Thank you for holding the ground that day, for giving me someone worth saving." He left the next morning. Cale watched his transport take off, carrying him back to Washington, to his family, to his future. She felt the absence of him, the absence of that connection to the past, but also the rightness of it. Stories had beginnings and middles and ends. This felt like progress toward conclusion. Master Sergeant Cale Renner's final flight in Afghanistan came on a clear morning in late October. The war was ending, officially, gradually, with the complicated logistics of nations extracting themselves from conflicts they could neither win nor abandon cleanly. Most aircraft had already been repositioned or decommissioned. The Warthogs were among the last to leave, those ugly, beloved, brutally effective machines that had defined close air support for a generation. Hog 17 was slated for retirement. Too many flight hours, too much combat damage over too many years. The airframe was structurally sound but economically impractical to maintain. It would be flown back to Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona, processed, probably scrapped for parts. Chief Acaffer fought the decision, argued for preservation, lost. Some battles couldn't be won with maintenance skills and determination. "She deserves better," he said, standing beside Cale on the flight line the day before departure. "She deserves rest," Cale replied. "She's done enough." "So have you." Cale didn't answer. Her 20 years were almost complete. Retirement paperwork was filed. She'd be eligible to separate in 4 months. The Air Force had offered incentives to stay, dangled promotions and choice assignments. She'd declined them all. 20 years was enough. She'd served honorably, accomplished what she'd set out to do, earned her place. Time to let younger pilots carry the burden. On her final morning, she performed an exhaustive pre-flight check. Ran her hands over every panel, inspected every seam, traced the outline of the faded 4-leaf clover. The Hog was clean, prepped, ready. Acaffer had ensured perfection one last time. He stood watching, arms crossed, face carefully neutral. "It's been an honor, Chief." "Likewise, Sergeant." He handed her something, a small patch, embroidered clover, identical to the one on the fuselage. "Figured you'd want a keepsake." Cale took it, felt the weight of symbolism and memory. "Thanks, Chief, for everything." "Bring her home safe." "Always do." She climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, started the engines. They caught smoothly, roaring to life like they'd done thousands of times before. She taxied to the runway, performed her final checks, received clearance. The control tower's voice was professional, routine, giving no indication this was anything other than another flight. "Hog 17, winds calm, cleared for takeoff." "Roger Tower, Hog 17 rolling." She advanced the throttles. The Hog accelerated down the runway, gathering speed, that familiar moment where the aircraft transitions from ground-bound machine to something capable of defying gravity. She rotated, lifted off, climbed into the Afghan sky one last time. Below, Kandahar airfield shrank away, became insignificant, became memory. Cale Renner flew Hog 17 across 3 countries and an ocean. She refueled twice, stopped overnight in Germany, continued west. The flight was long and monotonous, hours of monitoring instruments and managing fuel, the unglamorous reality of aviation that existed between dramatic moments. She didn't mind. The monotony was its own meditation, a chance to process and remember and begin the work of letting go. Somewhere over the Atlantic, at 30,000 feet with nothing but water below and stars above, she thought about everything that had brought her here. The choices, the chances, the chaos that had woven itself into a career. She thought about Davies and his kids, about the 47 men whose futures existed because she'd refused to believe the situation was impossible. She thought about Chief Acaffer and his stubborn loyalty to an aging aircraft. About Colonel Hendricks and the trust he'd placed in her that desperate day. About all the people whose lives had intersected with hers in small and large ways.